Hi there, I'm Adam Elwanger. I'm going to give a lecture tonight on changes in rhetorical theory as we enter the modern period of history. This is primarily for my 5317 course at the University of Houston downtown, but I hope that some other people find it useful. Hope everybody's doing well with this shelter-in-place thing with the coronavirus. I'm going to do this video in two parts, and we're going to talk about two different authors, Friedrich Nietzsche and Ferdinand de Saussure. And I think that I will point out in the second video where there are some links between those two thinkers. But for this first one, I want to focus on Nietzsche, and specifically his text on truth and lies in a non-moral sense. And then we will talk a bit about a selection from Saussure's course in General Linguistics in the second video. So let me start a little bit with giving us some context to what changes as far as rhetorical theory is concerned as we enter the modern period. And we could argue about the dates of the modern period, like when we enter modernity. But for the sake of argument, I'm just going to peg it around 1800, because I think it may have been a little bit earlier than that even. But I think that that's right around the time where we really can see clearly that we've taken a turn in the way that rhetoric and lots of other things regarding philosophy and truth are understood. You know, in some ways we could see the changes in early thinkers like Bacon and Vico, and maybe to a certain degree Montaigne. But I think by the 19th century, the turn is clear. So what do I mean by this turn? Well, in the ancient world, and for most of history up until modernity, the assumption of people working in rhetorical theory was that meaning is not a rhetorical problem. In other words, that what a given claim means isn't an issue. We know what it means, that language on the face of it means what it says, and that the duty of rhetorical theory then is to figure out, well, how do we convince audiences that this claim is true? And so meaning just wasn't a problem for rhetorical theorists. But by the time that the modern era comes around, meaning itself becomes a rhetorical consideration. What do I mean by that? Well, I think that in modern thinkers, we start to approach this idea that perhaps meaning making itself is a product of rhetorical forces. That things come to mean what they appear to objectively mean through processes of rhetorical interaction. And I think that both Nietzsche and Saussure, to different degrees, are representatives of these ideas. So let's get into Nietzsche first. Nietzsche's problem is named in the title of this selection, on truth and lies in a non-moral sense. And our impulse usually when we think about truth and lies is to understand them morally, right? That truth is good and lies are bad. Truth is good because it is an authentic description or view of a reality that exists outside of human interaction. And lies are bad or evil because they don't accurately state the truth. And Nietzsche's trying to say, well, these concepts are actually not purely ethical or moral concepts, and he tries to understand them without recourse to right or wrong. So the opening to his text is really powerful, and so I'm going to read some passages here. We're working from the rhetorical tradition, Bezel and Herzberg's anthology, and so if you have that book, you're welcome to follow along. This is on page 1171, the opening, and I'll read at some length. Once upon a time, in some out-of-the-way corner of that universe which is dispersed into numberless twinkling solar systems, there was a star upon which clever beasts invented knowing. That was the most arrogant and mendacious minute of world history, but nevertheless it was only a minute. After nature had drawn a few breaths, the star cooled and congealed, and the clever beast had to die. One might invent such a fable, and yet he would still not have adequately illustrated how miserable, how shadowy and transient, how aimless and arbitrary the human intellect looks within nature. There were eternities during which the human intellect did not exist, and when it's all over with, the human intellect, nothing will have happened. For this intellect has no additional mission which would lead it beyond human life. Rather, it is human, and only its possessor and begetter takes it so solemnly. In other words, only human beings care as much about human prowess and knowledge as humans do. As though the world's axis turned within the human being. But if we could communicate with the gnat, we would learn that he likewise flies through the air with the same solemnity that the gnat feels the flying center of the universe within himself, just like a human. There's nothing so reprehensible and unimportant in nature that it would not immediately swell up like a balloon at the slightest puff of this power of knowing. And just as every porter wants to have an admirer, so even the proudest of men, the philosopher, supposes that he sees on all sides the eyes of the universe telescopically focused upon his action and thought. It's remarkable that this was brought about by the intellect, which was certainly allotted to these most unfortunate, delicate, and ephemeral beings, merely as a device for detaining them a minute within their own existence. For without this addition, they would have every reason to flee this existence as quickly as Lessing's sun. The pride connected with knowing and sensing lies like a blinding fog over the eyes and senses of men, thus deceiving them concerning the value of their existence. For this pride contains within itself the most flattering estimation of the value of knowing. Deception is the most general effect of such pride, but even its most particular effects contain within themselves something of the same deceitful character. So let's pause there for a moment, and I want to point our attention to three things. First of all, you can see that Nietzsche is a beautiful writer, that he's writing in a way that we haven't seen other rhetorical theorists write. And he writes in a polemical way. He used to talk about philosophizing with a hammer, right? There's a lot of force in this language. If you want to go over it, look at the different adjectives and adverbs that get used in just that passage that we read. But two words come up a lot: inventing or invention and knowing in this. And these are two of the concepts that we've talked about as rhetorical concerns throughout the semester. Invention, of course, is the first of the 5 canons of rhetoric, right? And knowledge, or episteme, is this idea that we've talked about. And the question that's been kind of moving through our readings this semester has been, does rhetoric produce knowledge, or does does knowledge exist prior to rhetoric? Does knowledge exist prior to rhetoric, and rhetoric just serves to spread the knowledge? Okay? And Nietzsche takes a definitive answer here, right? He says that knowledge and knowing are inventions. Okay? So this is a big move away from where we've been throughout rhetorical history so far. And he says, essentially, that episteme, if knowledge is understood as an accurate reflection of the truth that exists outside of the human consciousness, right? He says if that's what we're going to understand knowledge as, then knowledge is really no different than just sort of doxa, a collective shared opinion of the world. So let's continue. We already see that we're working with these rhetorical ideas of invention and knowledge production. The second passage that I want to look at is on 1172. It picks up right where we just left off. It says, as a means for preserving the individual, the intellect unfolds its principal powers in dissimulation. Dissimulation, of course, is trickery, lying, misrepresentation. Dissimulation, which is the means by which weaker, less robust individuals preserve themselves or protect themselves, since they've been denied the chance to wage the battle for existence with horns or with the sharp teeth of the beasts of prey. This art of dissimulation reaches its peak in man. Deception, flattering, lying, deluding, talking behind the back, putting up a false front, living in borrowed splendor, wearing a mask, hiding behind convention, playing a role for others and for oneself. In short, a continuous fluttering around the solitary flame of vanity is so much the rule and the law among men that there is almost nothing which is less comprehensible than how an honest and pure drive for truth could have arisen among them. All right, let's pause for a second there. So, Nietzsche talks about how human beings got screwed, right? In the animal kingdom, other animals were given amazing speed, or amazing sight, or great claws, or great teeth, and things like this. And what did human beings get? Well, none of that. What we got is this intellect, right? And just like animals use those special abilities and aspects of themselves to preserve themselves, well, we got to preserve ourselves too. And the one thing that we can preserve ourselves with is our intellect. And he says that this takes the form of that takes the form of deception. That an ability to deceive is what enables us to persist as individuals. So we have three concepts working now. We got invention, we got knowing or episteme, and we have, let's say, deception, right? And of course, deception is this idea that has been a part of the critique of rhetoric throughout its entire history. People say that, well, rhetoric is just a kind of manipulation or fraudulent misrepresentation of the truth. Okay, so in covering some of the other aspects of some passages I won't read, Nietzsche goes on to say that human beings have this dual impulse built into them, and I think it's obvious that this is the case, right? On the one hand, we have this impulse for war, and that is we want to get over other people. We want to be better than other people. We want to have more, we want to do more, that there's this competitive, agonistic relationship between each human being in the world. And that's true, right? And he says that's where this deception comes into play. That's where this will to deceive comes into play. But human beings have this other impulse, which is society, right? And what that is like, rather than the individual trying to get over on everybody else, the individual wants to belong to everybody else. Why? Well, because there's safety in numbers, right? There's safety in numbers, and so to some degree, it can't just be war all the time, right? There needs to be some degree of security around other people, and that requires this collective deception, as we'll see, a collective agreement, if you want, an establishment of a doxa, right? And I think that's really what Nietzsche's getting at here, is this idea that what is presented as knowledge or episteme is in fact something that is really just opinion that has been rhetorically framed as truth. All right, so let's look at the third passage here. Passage 3. I'm going to read it a little bit of length. He says, the contrast between the truth and the lie arises here for the first time. Here's where he gives the definitions of the truth and the lie. He says, the liar is a person who uses the valid designations, the words, in order to make something which is unreal appear to be real. He says, for example, I'm rich, when the proper designation for his condition would be poor. He misuses fixed conventions by means of arbitrary substitution or even reversals of names. If he does this in a selfish manner, or moreover harmful manner, society ceases to trust him and they'll thereby exclude him. And what men avoid by excluding the liar, is not so much being defrauded as it is in being harmed by means of fraud. Thus, even at this stage, what they hate is basically not deception itself, but rather the hated consequences of certain sorts of deception. It is in a similarly restricted sense that the man now wants nothing but truth. He desires the pleasant, life-preserving consequences of truth. He is indifferent towards pure knowledge, which has no consequences, right? Toward those truths which are possibly harmful and destructive, he is even hostilely inclined. And besides, what about these linguistic conventions themselves? Are they perhaps products of knowledge, that is, of the sense of truth? Are designations congruent with things? Is language an adequate expression of all realities? It is only by means of forgetfulness that man can ever reach the point of fancying himself to possess a truth of the grade just indicated. If he will not be satisfied with truth in the form of tautology, that is to say, if he will not be content with empty husks, then he will always exchange truths for illusions. What is a word? It is the copy in sound of a nerve stimulus. But the further inference from the nerve stimulus to a cause outside of us is already the result of a false and unjustifiable application of the principle of sufficient reason. All right. So let's pause there for a second. So he says what the liar is the person who uses designations, words, to misrepresent something. So the person says, I'm rich, when they're false. Or, when they're poor. Or they say, I was born in Houston, when they were born in New York, right? Because, Houston doesn't mean New York. New York means New York. Right? And so that what they're doing is using the word, the designation, in a way that is not the collectively accepted way to do that, right? So, for example, to put this a different way, right? Is there any reason that the refrigerator is called the refrigerator other than the fact that we've all agreed to call it that, right? Well, no, right? Could you call the refrigerator lettuce? Yeah, sure. You could, when you notice that the fridge is open and should be closed, you could yell to the person in the kitchen, hey, close the lettuce, right? But that doesn't make sense. It's not intelligible. That doesn't mean anything. And therefore, it doesn't produce the effect that you want it to produce. In other words, you don't persuade the person to close the fridge because they don't understand what you mean when you say to close the lettuce. Now, that's not a big example, right? We wouldn't call that a lie, though. We wouldn't say, well, it's a lie to say close the lettuce. Notice, he says that it's not that it's untrue, right, that people are bothered by the lie. The lie becomes a lie because of the harm that can come from it, right? So, there is a harm when somebody says, hey, I'm rich, right, and tries to convince you, why don't you come on vacation with me, right? And then, well, why is that a lie? Because, when you come on vacation with them, you may find out really quickly that, in fact, they're not rich, and that you're paying for a lot of meals and stuff like that that you wouldn't have otherwise paid for, right? And so the problem with the lie is not in its untruth strictly. It's in the capacity of the untruth to inflict harm on others, or especially yourself. Let me have a look here. Then he asks deeper, right? He's like, so is our words actually accurate depictions of reality? And he says, no, they're not, because it's already moved through too many things, right? And so, when I say, oh, it's hot outside, right? He says that those words that just came out of my mouth are just kind of a representation or a transliteration of a particular sensory experience on my part. So I feel hot, right? And that registers because we've collectively agreed on what the concept of hot is, right? That I then put into mind, geez, I'm hot, right? And I speak it, right? Am I speaking truth when I say it's hot outside? Well, that depends. What's hot, right? I would certainly say it's been hot all week in Houston. I really don't like heat, and it's been sort of mid-80s. That's hotter than I'd like it, right? Other people in my neighborhood, when I say it's hot outside, it's not hot. This is nothing, right? But when it gets 98 outside and I say, oh, it's hot, right? People are going to say, oh, yeah, it is hot, right? So we agree, and then we say, oh, yes, it's true. That's a truth that it's hot. But true according to what? Only to the human perception of heat, right? And so the truth of whether or not something is hot is determined by, is it hot for human beings? And if it is, well, then, the truth is just an articulation of human experience, not the truth of the real world, right? Hot compared to what, right? Okay, so let's continue. So he's expressing, questions about the very medium of language in its ability to get at truth. He says it really can't. Language is insufficient to advance propositions that have that status of sort of universal transcendental truth. All right, so now he's talking about, this is on page 1173, the thing that the word refers to, right? The thing that a word refers to, the actual thing, right? That's what he's talking about when he says the thing in itself. So he says, the thing in itself, which is precisely what the pure truth, apart from its consequences, would be, is likewise something quite incomprehensible to the creator of language, and something not in the least worth striving for. This creator only designates the relations of things to men. It's only about how they relate to men, what we were just saying. And for expressing these relations, he lays hold of the boldest metaphors. To begin with, a nerve stimulus is transferred into an image. That's the first metaphor. Then the image in turn is imitated in a sound, the second metaphor, right? And each time there's a complete overleaping of one sphere right into the middle of an entirely new and different one. One can imagine a man who is totally deaf and has never had a sensation of sound and music. Perhaps such a person will gaze with astonishment at Chladni's sound figures. Perhaps he will discover their causes in the vibrations of string, and will now swear that he must know what men mean by sound. It's this way with all of us concerning language. We believe we know something about the things themselves when we speak of trees, colors, snow, flowers, and yet we possess nothing but metaphors for things, metaphors which correspond in no way to the original entities. Okay, so let's get that right. So I'll use an example right now of somebody in our class. Let's say Gabriella, right? So here's what he's talking about there, about the transliteration to one field or another. So I said, I'll use somebody in our class, and I started thinking about your faces, and Gabriella popped up, okay? And what happened was a memory of mine, of somebody who's in my class, popped up. In the head, I saw an image, right? I saw Gabriella's face. And then I said, hey, let's go with Gabriella, right? In other words, I gave a name to that image, right? Actually, that happened cognitively. And then I reiterated that image or that name in a sound, right? Now that sound is supposed to stand in for the truth of this person. Maybe it does, but Nietzsche's point is that we jump from a world of memory to a world of cognition to a world of sound, right? And then to truth, right? And these are big, big leaps, especially when we're not talking about something as simple as a person, but rather, say, an abstract idea like goodness or complex topics like immigration or the economy, right? There's huge leaps from the reality of the things we're talking about to the truth status of what we speak about those things, okay? Let me peek at my notes for a minute here. Okay, let's look at this passage where he returns to the question of invention then. back to invention. So he says, this is on 1174, in particular, I'm going to back up a step. Thus, the genesis of language does not proceed logically in any case, and all the material within and with which the man of truth, the scientist, and the philosopher later work and build, if not derived from Never Never Land, is at least not derived from the essence of things. In particular, let's consider the formation of concepts. Every word instantly becomes a concept, precisely insofar as it is not supposed to serve as a reminder of the unique and entirely individual experience to which it owes its origin. But rather, a word becomes a concept insofar as it simultaneously has to fit countless more or less similar cases, which means purely and simply, cases which are never equal and thus altogether unequal. Every concept arises from the equation of unequal things. Just as it is certain that one leaf is never totally the same as another, so it is certain that the concept leaf is formed by arbitrarily discarding these differences. Okay, and so he says that the concept, any concept, and after all, what a concept is, more or less, is a category, whether we're talking about couches, eggs, microphones, any of these things. What they are is they're categories that are enabled by erasing differences between things. Okay? So just like he says, every leaf is different. And yet, we only know a leaf when we see it because we're willing to erase certain differences that the particular leaf embodies when compared with other leaves. Right? And so we sort of fetishize these particular characteristics that enable us to say, yes, there's a leaf, there's a leaf, there's a leaf, there's a different kind of leaf. Right? Whereas if we didn't do that, if we looked at the totally unique features of each individual leaf, then we might never even be able to name it as leaf because it would look strange to us. Right? And so he says that this erasure of differences is what enables knowledge, right? Just sort of a generalization of experience, a universalization of experience, rather than encountering everything we see anew as its own thing, outside of any sort of categorical paradigm, right? Now, he gets to in a minute why we can't do that, right? Or why we won't, rather. But for now, that's important to understand that these inventions of categories, right, which we like to think as a creative endeavor, right, is actually a kind of forgetting, which is not terribly artistic or creative, just to forget. And it's a willed forgetting, right? It's just a sort of subconscious decision to ignore the differences that would complicate the truth or reality of this thing, okay? All right, so what is truth? Well, he gets to this in the second column on 1174. He says, this is middle of the page, what then is truth? A movable host of metaphors, metonymies, and anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which have been poetically and rhetorically intensified, transferred, established, in which after long usage seem to people to be fixed, canonical, and binding. Truths are illusions, which we have forgotten are illusions. They are metaphors that have become worn out and have been drained of sensuous force. Coins which have lost their embossing and are now considered as metal and no longer as coins. Okay, so that's pretty heavy, right? First off, he says that truth is a rhetorical phenomenon, that it's rhetorically intensified, right? And just like a coin that's been in circulation for a long, long time, and by the way, the coin here is a metaphor for an idea, whether that's, leaf or whether it's goodness, right? That these linguistic signifiers, people use them, people keep using them and keep using them. And just like a coin that keeps on getting used, eventually all of the embossing is worn off of it, and all we have is a hunk of metal. And when we look at the hunk of metal, we don't even see anymore that it's a manufactured coin. What we see is, a hunk of metal. It's naturally occurring, right? But a coin tells us. We can look at a coin with the embossing and say, this is a human construction, right? And so Nietzsche is saying that truth, through its rhetorical circulation, the circulation of it wears off the evidence that it's really just sort of an arbitrary human invention. And we perceive this human invention as the reality of the world outside of us. Okay? Now, what are the good and bad things that come of this, right? Well, Nietzsche says that, this is an elaborate act of deception. But if we go back, it's actually to preserve ourselves in society, right? To keep ourselves safe. That we agree to use the typical coins, the typical signifiers of things, right? Now, the problem with this, he says, is rather tragic. And it's that our experience is profoundly limited by this because we blind ourselves to the really unique versions of reality and existence that perhaps can't be categorized in this way, that perhaps defy our understanding of truth and confuse us, right? Now, there is an alternative to this. So let's look. I'm going to jump ahead to my last passage and shorten up this video by a couple minutes, right? This is at the end of the reading, and I'll read it and then discuss it a little bit. He says, maybe I should back up a sec. All right, I'm going to, like I said, this is on 1178. There are ages in which the rational man and the intuitive man stand side by side. The rational man in fear of intuition, and the intuitive man with scorn. Sorry, I got that backwards. Here, let me read it again. There are ages in which the rational man and intuitive man stand side by side. The one in fear of intuition, the other with scorn for abstraction. The latter, the intuitive man, is just as irrational as the former, the rational man, is inartistic. They both desire to rule over life. The former, that is the rational man, by knowing how to meet his principal needs by means of foresight, prudence, and regularity. The latter, the intuitive man, wants to rule the world by disregarding those needs, and as an overjoyed hero, he counts as real only that life which has been disguised as illusion and beauty. All right, I'm going to skip down about 15 lines. The man who is guided by concepts and abstractions, in other words, the man who's seeking truth, right, through rational means, only succeeds by such means in warding off misfortune, without ever gaining any happiness for himself from these abstractions. And while he aims for the greatest possible freedom from pain, the intuitive man, standing in the midst of a culture, already reaps from his intuition a harvest of continual, inflowing illumination, cheer, and redemption, in addition to obtaining a defense against misfortune. To be sure, the intuitive man suffers more intensely when he suffers. He even suffers more frequently than the rational man, right? Since he doesn't know how to learn from experience and keeps falling over and over again into the same ditch. He is then just as irrational in sorrow as he is in happiness. He cries aloud and will not be consoled. How differently the stoical man, the rational man who learns from experience and governs himself by concepts, is affected by the same misfortunes. The stoical man, who at other times seeks nothing but sincerity, truth, freedom from deception, and protection against ensnaring surprise attacks, now executes a mastery of just deception. He executes his masterpiece of deception in misfortune, as the other type of man executes his in times of happiness. The stoical man wears no quivering and changeable human face, but as it were a mask with dignified, symmetrical features. He does not cry, He does not even alter his voice. When a real storm cloud thunders above him, he wraps himself in his cloak, and with slow steps he walks from beneath it. Okay, so now we get the consequences of these two things. He says that that the intuitive man, the man who won't live by this doctrine of truth, who won't blind himself to the innumerable experiences and ideas in the world that don't conform to rationality, right? That intuitive man has great joys because he can experience things that others of us can't experience, right? Because all we can see is the erasure of differences. Now, those erasure differences allow us to protect ourselves, right? So if I one time, got robbed, right, in a certain part of the city, right, then the next time that I'm going through a part of the city at a similar time, right, I might say, you know what, maybe I should avoid that place over there at this time, That was the place and the time that I got robbed last time I was down here. You know what, I'll stay away from it. And that planning, that rational thought, insulates me from harm, right, because I'm creating all these abstractions and generalizations, right? But it also, that same way of thinking, insulates me from a variety of experiences, both positive and negative, right? And so what he says is the rational man, sorry, I'm looking for my marker. What did I do with it? Here it is. The rational man's life, if we were to graph it, looks like this. In other words, there's ups and downs, but there's never any huge ups or huge downs, right? And that's the sort of life that's afforded to us through this truth game that we're playing, because it allows us to insulate ourselves from negative consequences. On the other hand, the intuitive man, the artistic man, the man who is not concerned with the erasure of differences in order simply just to play this self-protective truth game, his experience, life experience, if we were to graph it, looks more like this. Huge ups, huge downs, right? And so he suffers more than the rational man. And when he suffers worse than the rational man. But he also has much higher highs than the rational man. And so I think that Nietzsche is pointing us to, first of all, that the truth really is a game about self-preservation, right? He's pointing us to how rhetoric works to secure the rules of that game and ensure that it proceeds by those rules, right? And he's pointing us towards the costs of living by those rules and showing us the ways that our rhetorical choices, things like our use of language, things like what we see, determines, right, a way of life, a way of living. And he recognizes that certain ways of living are experientially inferior or superior to others. Okay? Now, I don't think any of us live in this later way, right? But I think that that's what Nietzsche's pointing out, is that in the modern era, particularly the scientific era, like, human beings don't even realize anymore that they're playing a truth game, right? And what he's looking to do is to reawaken us to the potential for a different kind of life that would necessarily entail a different deployment of rhetoric and rhetorical theory. So I'm going to break the video here. I'll come back in a few minutes, do one on Saussure, and make some connections to Nietzsche. Thank you. If you have questions, comments, just put them down in the comments bar below.